Welcome to today's Explainer. You know, when we think about the absolute most effective weapons of World War II, our minds usually go straight to heavy machinery, right? We picture massive tanks, long-range bombers, or maybe some groundbreaking new artillery. But today, we're looking at a psychological weapon that was far more powerful than any of those. And the crazy part? It was literally just a piece of paper. The Germans called it the Passierschein. And by the time the war ended, this single piece of paper would be responsible for more German surrenders than any actual military campaign on the entire Western Front.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. It's February 9th, 1945. You're in the freezing, absolute mud of the Reichwald Forest. Canadian troops are slowly pushing their way through these totally shattered pillboxes. And suddenly, a group of German soldiers emerges. Their hands are up. But if you look closely at what these men are holding, they don't have weapons. Instead, pressed completely flat against their chests is this single brightly colored slip of red paper. Now, you really have to ask yourself, how in the world did a damp, creased piece of paper become more valuable to a soldier than his own rifle? Well, if you could zoom in on the English text right at the top of that little postcard-sized red paper, it simply read, "Safe Conduct." Now, the Canadian riflemen who were actually taking these prisoners, half the time they had absolutely no idea what they were even looking at. But the German soldiers sure did. See, they weren't surrendering despite having this paper. They were surrendering because of it. But why? Why did this one specific piece of paper hold so much power over men who had been relentlessly drilled since 1939 that surrendering was the ultimate treason? To really get that, we have to talk about what historians call the massive surrender problem of 1944. See, even with the Allies having total air superiority and just massive, overwhelming firepower, German soldiers simply would not stop fighting. And it wasn't because of unwavering loyalty to the regime. It was terror, just sheer terror. 15,000. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of German soldiers executed by their own military justice system during the war, mostly for desertion. A guy didn't even need to run away. If he just hesitated for a second, he could end up facing a firing squad from his own officers faster than he'd be shot by the enemy. So these troops were totally paralyzed by these dual fears. It wasn't just the executioners standing right behind them in their own ranks. It was the terrifying retribution waiting for their families back home. We're talking loss of food rations, housing, and basic civil rights. And if that wasn't bad enough, you've got Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine blasting them 24/7 with the message that unconditional surrender meant your family starves to death while you rot in a cage in Siberia. So to a German soldier shivering in a foxhole, giving up to the Americans or British felt just as much like a death sentence as surrendering to the Russians. The Allies realized pretty quickly that they had a monumental task on their hands. They had to convince these terrified men that it was actually safe to give up. Enter American Brigadier General Robert McClure. He was put in charge of psychological warfare, and his intel guys quickly found a fatal flaw in the old leaflets the Allies had been dropping. For starters, they were printed on this ultra-cheap paper that just disintegrated in the rain. Plus, they made these ridiculously exaggerated promises, like telling them they get to take university courses in the PO camps. I mean, German officers were literally reading these out loud to their men as a joke to prove the Allies were liars. The lesson was clear. German soldiers did not trust flashy flyers. They trusted documents. So, McClure's team decided to ruthlessly hack the German respect for bureaucracy. First, they swapped out the cheap stuff for this thick, saturated red paper that would stand out brilliantly in the mud. Then, they mimicked the exact cross-hatching layout you'd see on official bank bonds, slapped on very official-looking dual national seals, and completely stripped back the promises. They just offered basic food and survival because, well, modesty sounded like the truth. And for the finishing touch, they stamped the whole thing with the undeniable, unquestionable authority of Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower's personal signature. And guys, here is the absolute psychological masterstroke. You have to understand that in Germany, a culture built on like 600 years of deep bureaucratic tradition, a document isn't just a piece of information. It is absolute authority. You don't read a document to see if you agree with its points. You check if it has the right stamps and seals to prove it's authentic. And if it's real, you obey it. So the Passierschein wasn't trying to persuade anybody. It was literally functioning as a legal permission slip from a supreme commander that ordered them to stop fighting. In the mind of a German soldier, this piece of paper outranked his own commanding officers.
But hey, right, a perfect document is completely useless if you can't actually get it to the target. And the delivery methods they came up with were just incredibly ingenious. Sure, you had massive B-17 bombers dropping these huge Moreau bombs from 30,000 feet. But when they needed pinpoint accuracy right over the trenches, they actually used artillery. They'd hollow out standard 25-pounder artillery shells, pack them tight with 1,500 rolled-up leaflets, and fire them over the lines. Instead of exploding into deadly shrapnel, they would just give a little pop about 50 yards up in the air and slowly rain this official salvation right down onto the helmets and sandbags below.
Now, we know for a fact that this weapon was devastatingly effective. How? Because the German High Command absolutely lost their minds over it. They panicked so hard, they actually printed their own counterfeit parody leaflets. They perfectly copied that thick red paper and the official seals, but they tweaked the text so it said the bear had a genuine wish to go into captivity for the next 10 years to betray his fatherland. But as any military historian will point out, an army doesn't waste its precious, limited resources counterfeiting a weapon if it isn't hurting them. By bothering to print a fake, the German command was basically admitting that the Passierschein was completely tearing their front lines apart. The paranoia from the German command eventually reached a total fever pitch. Just possessing one of these Allied leaflets was made a capital offense. Think about that. You could literally be court-martialed and shot dead just for holding a piece of paper. The field police started doing random aggressive searches. So just to keep one of these passes, an ordinary soldier had to commit this profound, incredibly risky act of private rebellion. They were meticulously hiding this red paper inside their boots, tucking it under the leather lining of their helmets, or carefully slipping it right between the pages of their official paybooks. Which leads us to maybe the most brilliant accident of the whole war. It's a concept called proof by suppression. The Allied designers never actually planned for this, but those draconian punishments, they completely backfired. They accidentally validated the whole document. From the ordinary soldier's perspective, if his own officers were this terrified of a simple piece of paper, then whatever it was promising had to be absolutely real. The massive effort to suppress it actually became the ultimate proof of its authenticity. The sheer desperation these guys had to hold on to this promise is beautifully captured by this one staggering event out in the Scheldt estuary. Imagine this. 3 German soldiers walk out of the mud to surrender together. But they are all physically clutching 3 different corners of a single shared pass. It was almost superstitious. It's as if they believed that if they let go of it, the magic wouldn't apply to them, like they physically needed to be touching the Supreme Commander's order to ensure they'd survive. And the impact on the battlefields was just immediate. A great example is the island of North Beveland. The 14th Canadian Hussars were totally outnumbered there, and they had absolutely no infantry reinforcements coming. So what do? They call in 18 Typhoon fighter bombers to do a screaming, terrifying low-level pass right at treetop height. The crazy thing? The planes didn't drop a single bomb. They didn't fire one single round. It was a massive bluff. But combined with a loudspeaker just telling the Germans to use their safe conduct passes, well, because the troops were already completely saturated with that red paper, that simple roar of aircraft triggered 450 German soldiers to surrender in a matter of hours. They took the whole island without firing a shot. Fast forward to the dramatic climax of the war in May 1945, and the scale of this becomes truly astronomical. 120,000 German soldiers, completely trapped and starving behind the Greb line, surrendered to the 1st Canadian Army. And as they marched into custody in what was one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire European theater, thousands and thousands of them reached into their pockets and pulled out these incredibly worn, faded, meticulously preserved red papers. They handed them over to the Canadian sentries exactly the same way a traveler hands a passport to a border guard. But actually, scratch that. Here is the ultimate takeaway. A piece of paper, no matter how brilliantly designed, is absolutely nothing without a contract of trust. The troops who were actually receiving the surrender had to honor the document. And the Canadian forces had built up this really fierce but incredibly decent reputation. Word traveled super fast through the prisoner grapevine that the Canadians actually honored the Geneva Convention. They had their medics treating German wounded, and they even shared their rations and cigarettes. The Passierschein gave the German soldier the legal permission to surrender, sure, but it was the fundamental decency of the enemy forces that gave them a real reason to believe it. It's just this powerful reminder of how systems only work when trust is maintained. To put the sheer scale of this operation into perspective, between June 1944 and May 1945, an unbelievable 3 billion copies of the Passierschein were printed. 3 billion! Allied printing presses over in Britain were running at like 80% capacity just for leaflets. It absolutely cements this incredibly engineered little red document as the single most effective psychological weapon in history. But, as intelligence officers noted at the time, calling it propaganda really isn't accurate. Because, well, propaganda usually relies on lies. And the Passierschein? It simply told the truth. Which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought from General McClure himself. It really begs the question, are wars won simply by blowing up and destroying the enemy's weapons, or by destroying their actual reason to fight? The story of the Passierschein proves that sometimes the most devastatingly powerful weapon on a battlefield isn't a bomb or a tank or a bullet. Sometimes it's just a little piece of paper that says, "You can stop now," fully backed up by the decency of the people standing behind it. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will definitely catch you next time.